Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. This will be a new progress update video. You may notice that the location has changed, and that's because I figured I should probably move my development environment from my bedroom, because it has gotten to the point where I would wake up and the first thing I would see is the desk, the chair, the workstation. It's not that I don't enjoy doing this stuff, but sometimes when I want to take a break, I don't want to be reminded of work every time I wake up. So what I've done is segregated rest and leisure from work. It is all joined in one single space now. And the benefit of this is that at any point in time when I'm doing, let's say, programming or animation, working on my games, I can say, oh, you know what? I got an idea. And I can just write some music. So yeah, got that moved here. I think that's gonna help tremendously with productivity. Sometimes I would get ideas, but the actual notion of having to go 2 stories down into the basement and then turn this on and turn that on and get everything set up is just like, ugh, I'll forget the idea by that point. So yeah, hopefully this will help with productivity, and just generally separating work from leisure, I think is just going to be a very, very good mental fix, so to speak. I'm already feeling like my room isn't a space that I kind of dread going in because I know that work is involved. I've pretty much entirely dedicated my room to sleep, leisure, and learning. So I think that's going to be very helpful. Now, this is an update video, but if you've been following my live streams, you will know everything that's been done here, because the stuff that I did in this video has been done like weeks and weeks and weeks ago. If you followed these videos for the updates, then this is for you. All right, let's get the ball rolling. Oh my god, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm actually adding hands to this game. The more I'm working on this project, the more ambitious it's becoming, but it's a bar that I can technically strive for, and I know I'm going to improve if I actually do achieve that bar. The more I'm working on this project, the more I want to make it better and better in quality. And one particular bar for quality that I find in games that I enjoy playing is the presence of these little micro cutscenes, the more personal interactions that play back, let's say, when the character tries to squeeze past a certain area, which provides you, the developer, the ability to create a checkpoint. So once they go through that tight area with this custom animation, you can lock the game to that point and unload the stuff in the previous zone and start loading stuff in the next zone. Narratively speaking, the presence of these special animations allows you to convey a particular emotion and mood that might actually be missed because the player might be frantically looking around for buttons and not paying attention. So it's a way to take control away momentarily so that you can focus their attention on something very important. So I consider it as another tool of narrative delivery. I've been replaying some of the older Call of Duty games, the ones that I've enjoyed when I was a kid. And I've always enjoyed the single-player campaigns of the Call of Duty games because they're always made to be very cinematic, very over-the-top, action-packed. It just makes you feel like a badass. And it allows you to create the sort of crafted scenarios and crafted events and occurrences that just simply can't happen naturally. It's also worth noting that up until this point, pretty much every game I've worked on that involved first-person character had no hands. It was just an item that flows to the side of the screen, and I gotta tell you, if this game was still a very small game, I probably would have just stuck to that. It seemed like a fairly reasonable way to handle it that didn't add a whole bunch of extra work that needs to be done on the animation front. But once I start focusing more on narrative and atmosphere and mood, and then delivery of the story, I feel like the presence of the hands is just going to be another vector along which I can tell the story. Plus, it's going to make the interaction with the world feel a lot more dynamic. Now, this doesn't mean that every single interactable component that I've programmed into the game that uses the mouse will now have to have a hand animation. That's not really a requirement, and it's not set in stone. But I feel that the most important interactions could deserve to have a custom hand animation that's just going to make that interaction feel a lot more significant. It seems to me like if something has a custom hand animation, then it is something that's worth having a custom hand animation for. Now, to set this up quickly so I can get experimenting with the whole concept, I basically just took the human reference from Make Human plugin and just cut off the body and left the hands and set up a quick rig. And honestly, for the time being, that should be more than enough. Since I'm on the subject of making hands display various objects that we're holding, I figured it might be a good idea to go over the radio decoder or the radio locator device, because the tests I've done up until this point have revealed that the size of the text, the frequency numbers, have not actually been very legible from their current camera perspective. So I took this opportunity to do some changes and revamp a couple of objects to make it look a little bit more interesting. Now, following the hard drive crash, which took most of my legacy with it, unfortunately, this was pre-me setting up GitHub for my current project, I realized that I lost the Substance Painter textures file for this radio decoder. Now, that sucks. But as much as it sucks, I figured it would be a good opportunity to maybe revisit the general design and color scheme of the whole radio locator and maybe fix some UV island issues, get some better texturing. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm kinda glad my hard drive died, because this second rendition of the texture came out way, way better. And all the changes I put together for the radio locator, including that switch, gave me an opportunity to make some pretty interesting animation choices when the player takes the item out. And the whole arrangement just looks a lot more interesting, with asymmetry being embraced a little bit more. The fruits of my labor came not too soon later, when I created this little inspection animation for when the player picks up the radio locator. This is actually a pretty major part of the gameplay, because it allows you to locate the key bunker chunks and important locations scattered all across the swamp. So to commemorate or communicate that this is an important object, when the player picks it up, this inspection animation will play, hopefully communicating to the player that this is an important object, much more important than your standard loot or light bulbs or resources you pick up around the swamp. Something else, of course, that I'm going to add to this inspection animation is a little bit of a mysterious soundtrack. Again, just to give it more importance as a vital item to the gameplay. Now, of course, adding hands means now every item that the player can equip and hold to the side of their screen will need to have some sort of a custom takeout animation. In the case of the radio locator, the player will take it out and then flip the switch to turn it on, because I don't want it having constantly emitting its sounds unless it is equipped. But on the other hand, maybe I can write a little side routine where if the radio locator is detected inside of the player's inventory, when they pass some sort of an important location without realizing it, it can emit some sort of a slow beep or sound or some sort of a hum as an indicator. The final takeout animation looks like this, and I gotta tell you, I don't know what I was dreading about. The addition of hands is a relatively trivial matter. You just have to do it at least once or twice, as I've been doing in this project, and then I propagated the FPS hands to a couple of my other projects. It's not that difficult, and it adds such a nice level of interaction, and I'd say a bit of a quality. It's really weird. I've been dreading adding FPS hands just from the fear of the overhead that it would add to the whole production, but having done it at least once or twice, it's honestly not that bad. It's a little annoying, there's a little bit of extra work, but I guess if you spend a lot of time doing animations, it doesn't really seem as much. Seems more like a drag than difficulty, to be honest. And well, of course, now that we have hands, we can literally animate anything. And one of the mechanics the player takes advantage of in this game is the ability to break open locked cabinets and supply stashes using a crowbar or a makeshift prying tool. My approach to this is very similar to what Batman Arkham series does, which is where you walk up to a vent, you press a button, and then you just mash A until the character rips the vent off and then pulls it aside. Except in my case, instead of using a button mashing technique, I read the speed of the mouse movement, so the player has to constantly move the mouse to simulate the prying movement. And really all the game does is just plays back the animation naturally as long as the player is moving the mouse. Again, the final result definitely beats the system I had in place up until this point, which is just player walking up to the cabinet, taking out the crowbar, looking at the cabinet, left-clicking and moving the mouse, and then the door maybe does a little nudge, little shuffle, and then it breaks open. This looks just eons better than what I had before. Now, I'm not gonna, kid myself. I know that I have a long way to go to create very nice looking animations. So, if you compare this, let's say, to other games with their animations, this has a long way to go. But if I compare it to itself and what the prying mechanic used to look like before, I would say it's a huge upgrade. Either way, there's always room for improvement, and we can always come back to this once we get more creative animation chops in place and revamp the animation further. Also, since we're on the subject of doing all the FPS animations, I figured I'll take one more core item that the player constantly uses in the game, which is a flashlight, and give the player a nice takeout animation, which has the player lift the flashlight up, fiddle with a bunch of wires in order to turn it on, and point it forward. So I'm going to be straight with you. The notion of having to make a custom takeout animation for every single item seems a little... It kind of explains why Fallout organizes its inventory items into weapons and aid, and everything else goes into like miscellaneous or resources category, because you never see the player actually holding anything but a weapon in your hand, and even for just maybe a couple of aid items like the stim packs, there would usually be a custom injection animation. So in that sense, the Fallout developers have saved themselves from having to animate each and every single item in the game, which there's a lot, hundreds, by employing categories, and aside from a few key exceptions, only allowing the player to take out and put away the weapons. So this is something that doesn't really become apparent until you start making your own game and find yourself having to encounter the same exact issues when you start realizing what other game developers employ in their games. Now, as I'm working on this project, I model and create various props that I deem necessary in this particular moment in time for whatever zone I'm putting together, and it's getting to the point where I got a big stockpile of 3D models that have been modeled but not textured, and this is something that I do quite often when I'm prototyping. I honestly can't really get myself to really immerse when everything is a box, placeholder, a bunch of primitives and cubes. So when it comes to some level geometry, maybe bunker kit or some props, furniture, I tend to just go off and quickly put something together. Usually takes anywhere between 10, 15, 20 minutes for a prop. So, it's fairly simple stuff. Now, I model these props, but I don't texture them, because texturing actually does take quite a lot of time, in certain cases longer than modeling, because I count UV mapping and texturing as a part of the same process. So I don't really need textures to immerse myself in the game, but I think I do need models. It helps quite immensely. So now I have this stockpile of models I've been making until this point that have no textures on them whatsoever, and I feel like I might actually lose track of everything that I've made that needs texturing, and then when I push the game out, there's going to be like a random untextured chair or some blocky cube texture shelf somewhere in the middle, and then it's just going to be embarrassing. So what I decided to do is make a new scene which acts as a glossary of all the 3D models that I've put together on my end, so that I can visit this scene and take a look at anything that still needs to be textured, so that it's a easy way of keeping track of unfinished stuff. Now, the next point I feel like is a step or a phase that any Godot developer is going to eventually come across. I feel like it's almost like a rite of passage for us Godot developers, and that would be the subject of creating engine plugins. You see, there are so many props that I'm finding a particular stage of applying textures and making materials for each and every single prop to be the most gruesome and useless time-wasting experience ever. I have posted on the Godot GitHub feature suggestions forum to add an automatic material creator into the engine's interface, which is when you have a bunch of textures like albedo, normal, roughness, metallic, all those maps, you give them a predictable suffix, like for albedo, it's _ALB, for normal, it's _N, for roughness, it's _rough, and this is excluding the combined map, the ORM map. So if you have these textures that have predictable, predefined suffixes, have a feature where you can select all those textures, press a button, and it creates the material for you. How difficult was that? Well, honestly, in hindsight, having made that myself because they refused to do it themselves, I decided to put together a plugin, and it wasn't actually difficult at all. And of course, that led me down the deep, very deep rabbit hole of creating all sorts of useful tools and plugins for my development progress. So enter the in-house homegrown plugin called Eisenstadt Tools. Essentially, it is a series of very small tools to help me automate a lot of the very mundane, very gruesome, very time-wasting processes, like, for example, creating a material from a series of textures. Or, let's say if I work on a kit of wall-mounted decorations, like the wall wires that you see in front of you right now. The wall wires have about 7, 10, maybe 15 iterations, which means for each and every one of those OBJ files, I have to create a new scene, give it a static body, give it a mesh instance, apply the material, which the material has to be made, so I have to create a new material, create drag and drop the albedo, normal, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, all those maps, and then apply it onto the mesh instance. All of that is literally non-productive at all. It's the intern work, so to speak. If you're a large studio, you hire an intern to go through the list of files and prepare all the materials for you so that you can focus on doing, your models and your hero props and all the animations and all the pretty stuff. So I've created essentially 2 tools at the moment. One of them, you can select a series of OBJ files and it will set up a separate scene for each selected OBJ, and optionally you can tell it to place a single material into the meshes. You can tell it to place a multicolored material, so if you have an object that's made out of 5 or 7 different materials, the plugin will automatically apply a differently colored material on each slot, which, by the way, is another feature that I hoped that Godot would actually implement inside of the engine, which is tell you which material slot number is which part of the mesh, because you don't know what is material slot 3 and what is material slot 7. So you import your model that has like 5 or 7 materials on it, and which one's material 3 and which one's material 5. I don't know, go apply an empty new material on it and change the albedo color, and then see what changes color on the model, or start applying guesswork to all the material slots. So this at least helps me to visualize which material slot is color coded on which part of the mesh. So for the time being, this is what I have up and running. I am thinking of adding some additional stuff, like having maybe a right-click menu with some additional features like instancing an object where the mouse is, so that it's a little bit easier to instance something instead of drag and dropping it into the level. It's a rabbit hole, for sure. You can think of all sorts of improvements you can build yourself until the end of times. Around this time, I came up with an interesting game mechanic, a fairly minor addition, but I figured it was a welcome one. Essentially, it's a concept of a safe room, kind of like what you have in Resident Evil games, but the way it works is it's a series of rooms, bunker rooms, that are scattered across the swampland. And first of all, these rooms are going to offer a little bit of an extra narrative for those who like story-heavy games or lore-heavy games. And there's also going to be a valuable item that would help the players to overcome their adversities and deal with the various entities they'll have to battle against. Each room will offer a different kind of object for them to acquire, and these safe rooms are not going to be accessible immediately. These rooms have a safety mechanism which is tied to the lore and the story and the events that took place that the player discovers, and in order for the player to gain access to these rooms, they have to essentially cleanse the immediate area of all the paranormal stuff because the room won't let them in otherwise. The rooms themselves will be filled with a lot of technology, props, workbenches, and computer terminals to read up on the events that transpired here. Now, the creation of these safe rooms facilitated the need to explore the Blender's geometry nodes feature, which I gotta tell you, very cool stuff. Of course, the first thing I decided to make are vines and roots, dynamic Bezier curve-based shapes, something that allows me to very quickly paint some new shapes with the grease pencil, export them into the game, and place them as quick put-together props. And I gotta say, Blender has been an absolutely invaluable tool. They've been adding so many game developer-oriented or game developer-useful features. This is just absolutely phenomenal. Another obstacle I wanted to add, and it's a fairly simple one, are blocking vines. These are very thick roots that the player needs to chop down using a machete or some sort of a sharp tool. I decided to try to simulate the physics using some rigid bodies and IK simulation in Godot, which I gotta tell you, on one hand, looks pretty natural. On another hand, very unpredictable. If you've ever seen the Fallout NPCs when they die and they're ragdolled to the ground, and then they fly off and their body stretches like the stretchy strong arm man toys from the 80s, yeah, that's what it looks like. And it sucks because it's like it's running Jolt engine, so technically the physics should be a lot more reliable, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. So I think I might just have to pre-animate these things with a baked animation just to be safe. I don't want the mood of the game to be ruined by something that could have been preventable. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the world triplanar mapping of the placeholder textures makes it look like a very long stringy turd falling down, so don't mind that. It's been duly noted when I was live streaming and people have commented on it. We're gonna get a proper texture on it, maybe put some leaves on it. I don't want that to look like Cookie Monster dookies. It also doesn't help that it's perfectly smooth and the depth map was not actually being used because, you know, world triplanar doesn't allow depth maps to apply themselves. I had to spend some time retracing old steps because it seems like a painful blight of indie game developers where they will make a feature and it will work perfectly fine and they'll move on to new features, and somehow later down the line some new features break the old features, so you got to go back and redo them. Well, in this case, some of the things I had to do was fix the animations, which Godot porting process from 3 to 4 had absolutely shagged into oblivion. Like, every single animation that I made using an animation player was just gone, which honestly makes me weary of animating stuff in Godot's animation player anymore. Maybe if I can help it, I'll just animate in Blender, because guess what? Then the frames are going to be preserved, they're not going to go anywhere. One of the animations that I lost was the tower animation, you know, the radio tower with all the dishes extracting and unfolding. Man, that one sucked. That one was especially painful. I should have just animated that thing in Blender. Now, just to change pace, I decided to practice a little bit of sculpting and see if I can maybe put together an enemy type, kind of like a spider-esque mutated thing that's going to have procedural crawling animation to make it stick to the ground on the uneven terrain. Some of these monsters are very heavily mutated weird things, almost like poor imitations of living creatures, and these ideas are inspired by the visual looks of the monsters from a movie called The Thing. That movie, honestly, is just one of my all-time favorites when it comes to horror genre. And I've been watching some behind-the-scene documentaries the folks have made about how they achieved some of the practical effects. There's so many interesting ways that they have achieved the strange animations, like filming certain movements, retracting, and then playing them in reverse. Or how they use some animatronics and robotics to get some very, very off-looking animations in these creatures. Now, this is where I started employing more and more the process of creating a very high poly model, high poly version of the model, and then creating a low retopologized version of that model on top. This was facilitated by me acquiring a plugin called RetopofLow that allows you to very quickly create loops, low topology versions on top of your high poly using like quick polygon creation tools and then patch tools that just create massive, cover massive areas with polygons up to your discretion. So really anything that helps you speed up the process of retopology, because that is usually a pretty lengthy process to say the least. Now, being a sci-fi game and involving a lot of bunker locations, there's gonna be a fair number of technology or computers, racks, rack mount systems, and all of that requires a lot of buttons, dials, displays, all sorts of readouts, indicators, and if there's gonna be just one or two rack per the entire game, you can start spotting the repetition, and it starts getting a little bit too old, a little bit repetitive too soon. So what I decided to attempt here is to create a system where the racks are empty, so there's about 5 or 7 variations of rack designs, but the dials and indicators on it are chosen from a series of predefined inputs. Kind of like the way I handled the rack computers a while back. This was the same kind of concept, but the designs of the panels and racks themselves was drastically different. It wasn't open air for the player to see what's inside. And I figured this would be a relatively easy way of creating a lot of variety without having to actually manually create all that variety by hand. Again, a little bit of scripting goes a long way, so I've created a good dozen or 2 dozen of empty panels or dials, knobs, and indicators, and the racks themselves would choose which pattern they would like to display using a random number generator. Again, armed with my freshly acquired knowledge of geometry nodes, I decided to give the vine creation process a new go, because up until this point, I've used Bezier curves with their own built-in beveling tools and particle distribution along vertices, which sort of worked, sort of didn't. It looked a little generic and there weren't a lot of control points, so I decided to give geometry nodes another go and created a parameterized vine generation tool with things like scale, reduction in thickness, distribution, rotation, parameters to boot. This of course meant I needed a texture for the vines, and I just decided to paint something on my own because, well, I need to get painting practice either way, so might as well stick to hand-painted textures. Another piece of foliage I created are not really vines, but they're plants that seem to creep their way into just about every crack and crevice in a dilapidated building that they can find. Maybe it's like poison ivy, or maybe some sort of a different, very thinly stamped but very leafy green. And this was perfect to overlay on top of everything, literally everything. Racks, computers, tables, sides of buildings, crevices, cracks, having them stick outside of air vents and ventilation systems. It just makes it look so abandoned. And man, let me tell you, it's not until I started adding these elements, these overgrowth and abandonment sign elements, that just made the whole level look the part to what I was imagining. Just having it be overgrowth and overtaken by nature, just being abandoned and completely forgotten, yet standing sturdy in its time. This is the feeling that I'm trying to capture, and honestly, for the amount of work that it takes to create vines and create this type of foliage, you add a surprising amount of detail very cheaply. I need to invest more time into putting together maybe floor and wall-oriented foliage. Anything that sticks to a wall or grows from like cracks and grass and flowers and that sort of nonsense. I decided to revisit the machete mechanic, which right now it involved only a charge and an attack, and that was the only thing that you can actually do. Now, I envision that this would allow you to do either a quick attack or a long attack. And this meant I had to do a little bit of finagling with the code to, let's say, count how many milliseconds you've been holding the button, and if you let go too soon, or if you don't wait long enough for the charge up animation to kick in, then it's going to play the quick attack. So I had to revamp the knife mechanic, the machete mechanic, but in the end, it does allow me to either do a very long attack, a powerful attack, or a quick slice left and right attack. I had to create 2 separate slicing animations, from left and one from right, and I have to do some timekeeping to detect how long the player is holding the key to determine which kind of animations can be played back. Now, the key that I still have to figure out is communication. How do I communicate to the player how to execute either the long attack or the short attack? I could always do the Doom thing, pause the whole game, pop up the tutorial with video. It's like the dumbest but the most straightforward and clearly presented tutorial on how to do that. Or I could, I don't know, maybe find like a creative way of presenting some user interface pop-ups or notes or something along those lines to communicate to the player how to properly wield this tool. The last thing I've done was set up the code algorithm for the racks to choose various buttons and dials to display so that I don't have to manually create each and every single unique iteration by hand. Now, technically, there was still a little bit of handwork that had to be done because I figured that either I can go full randomness and have the panels completely randomly create patterns out of all of the available existing buttons and dials, but then, first of all, they're all different sizes. So I would have had to create some sort of an algorithm that detects, is it a big part? Does it occupy a lot of space? Does it overlap with the other ones? I could classify them as large or small, in which case small ones could take up 4 slots, and then large one could take up 1 slot. And try to figure out a system that way. But then there's a weird equilibrium that has to be reached between functionality, flexibility, and how much time has to be spent. Because if I go full random, then I'm probably going to spend just as much time coding as I would have spent just creating the actual elements by hand. So I decided to settle on a bit of a middle ground. I created a set of predefined arrangements, maybe 5 or 7 different arrangements to choose from, and then the racks would just pick from one of those arrangements and apply it to themselves, and that way it's kind of a middle ground. They're still designed to look like the elements sort of belong together. It's not just a bunch of random crap that doesn't make sense. Like, why is there a rotary dial right next to a big monitor? Like, what's the point of that? So it still chooses between some handmade arrangements, but it's still random in a way that I can just place this rack into the level, run the game, and it will just have all the buttons populated on it, and there's not as high of a chance of repetition. Alrighty, well, this is all I have for this update. You're all basically up to speed with the live stream watchers. Now, there are other games that I have to do updates on. I'm just not cramming them all into one video anymore. So stay tuned. I'll get you guys updated on other projects like Child of Ether and Dormant Ink and all that good jazz. Stay tuned. If you want to learn more about game development, check out theconceptbay.net. And I'll see you guys in the next update.